The Creature Outside Our Tent. Episode 1 of 1. A camping trip to the northern woods of Canada is disturbed by something in the night. Something of unspeakable terror that mortifies an 11-year-old boy and his family. Hunger, starvation, an unsettling presence. The Watcher from the Woods. Do you hear the drumming from the woods? Do you hear it coming closer from under the frozen trees? No, it is not drumming, but the wild heartbeat of some starving monster. Diary of Olivier Dubois, fur trader in Ojibwa territory, presumed missing, winter, 1673. It's been 20 years since that night, 20 years of shadows disturbing my sleep, waking me in feverish sweat and cold terror. I tried to banish the memory away, convince myself it was all just a dream, that our family camping trip to the Sioux Narrows on the Lake of the Woods was just a frightful figment of horror thought up by a lonely child. But it never seemed to work. Always the memory haunted, lingering in the back of my mind, gnawing little bites away from my sanity. I worry. Now that my first child is on the way, a beautiful baby boy, that my psychology, my bearing, will somehow rub off on him and taint him before he grows. I worry that I will be a bad father. I wish I could call on my own father now for advice, but he passed away. He was a psychiatrist in the Duluth area. That's where we grew up. We lived in the suburbs and got ice cream cones on hot days and went to the local pool and played in parks. It was just my younger sisters then, and my mom who stayed at home to take care of us, before my youngest brother was born. But by that time, I had seen what I had seen, and was already prescribed heavy sleeping pills to cure my insomnia. The doctors didn't know what else to do. I had spent the majority of my teenage years in and out of waiting rooms. They took so many MRIs of my brain that I feel like they must have burned a hole in it, just widening the crawl space for the memory to creep through. Now I'm 31, and the memory is more livid and clear and terrifying than ever before. I fear it is pulling me away from my wife and child. Just before he died, my father recommended I write my experiences in a diary, and so that is what I am doing. Writing a diary of my account of the night I saw my chilled breath in the tent, the sounds of something just outside. With this diary, I hope to purge it all, to release the pent-up emotions from my 11-year-old brain. My sisters were too young at the time to comprehend it, and my mother never saw what I saw. None of them did. Except maybe my father. But he never talked about it, and I never asked. Only when he was close to dying did he bring it up, but I stopped him from going too far. My heart could not take it. So here begins my account of that night in the woods. My pen shakes even now with a secret darkened room kind of fear. The kind of fear that shivers your body, mind, and soul. My heart beats in my chest, and I swear it actually hurts. But I know I must get through this. I will write this in its entirety, and then I will quietly slide next to my sleeping wife and fall asleep myself. I will put this to rest. We had driven up from Duluth along the shoreline of Lake Superior. The late summer sunlight glimmered on the surface of the water, ephemeral diamonds that only nature and all her chaos could create. The dark trees edged along the road on the opposite side. They came by in a blur. The thick deciduous trees and shadow-loving evergreens of Finland State Forest rolled by my backseat window. I put my forehead to the glass and felt the sun warm on my skin. The tiny vibrations of the car on the road made me sleepy, and by the time we were passing Superior National Forest, I was in a dream. I can't remember now what the dream fully was, but it was something like seeing my crush there at the campgrounds when we arrived. We walked and biked and swam in cool lakes before she gave me my first kiss. The sound of my mother calling out woke me, and I opened my eyes to see us passing through Grand Portage. "The border is close. You three get up now," my mom had said softly, now that we were awake. I looked over to my sisters. Amy was wiping her eyes while her lips nurtured her pacifier. She was 3 years old and still couldn't break from it. My parents only let her have it on car rides now to calm her. Hannah was next to her on the opposite side. She was looking out the window at the boats sailing soundlessly on the lake. I remember distinctly now how her hair looked in the light filtering through from the window, how it was brown but golden on top from the sun, and also how messy it was from lying on her pillow. It's funny how our minds pick out the small things to remember, things of no consequence. We crossed the border sometime in the afternoon. I didn't know it then, but I had also crossed over the border into a new phase of my life. A life where my childhood was left waving innocently goodbye in the rearview mirror. The Canadian scenery was the same as Minnesota, and the excitement of seeing a new country soon fell away as another long drive commenced. Though we stopped for dinner at a pancake and waffle house in Thunder Bay, which I had greatly appreciated as I was completely starving at the time. My father loved pancakes more than almost anything, and it seems my sisters and I also inherited the desire, for we never complained about eating them, night or day or night. After leaving the restaurant with my hunger gone, I remember the slow, lazy light of the sunset shining off a group of old cars in the parking lot. It was sleepy and dreamlike, and I remember then that I thought the sun must have a personality, not just the ability to take away the dark, that it had changes and emotions and sensations, like any human. And now it was in a mythical place, a quiet, winding down twilight in which all the worries of the day melted into a haunting sunset. I knew it was the earth that moved, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that the great orange orb had feelings too. I was a quiet child with quiet thoughts. My father said we would be driving through the night and we'd reach the Sioux Narrows campgrounds in the early morning. To this day, I don't know why we didn't just get a hotel in the city and finish the drive in the morning. But maybe my parents were tired of the road and wanted to get there as soon as possible. I don't remember them sleeping when we got there, though. It was strange, and I guess it will always be a secret strangeness that I never questioned. My sisters were asleep in the back seat again, but I looked out through my window at the scenery of the night as we drove further north into the Canadian woods. The white eye of a full moon grazed the tips of the dark pines, and I tried my hardest to peer into the hidden blackness as we drove past. A few times my heart would jump as I spotted the eye shine of animals hidden under the canopies as we went by the occasional intersections. It was in those moments of illumination by other car headlights that I realized the woods must be alive with creatures. Quiet creatures that stalk and hunt and call out to others in the night. I had never seen a wolf or a great bear, except in zoos. And the thought of hungry animals like that hugging to the shadows under the pines made my 11-year-old heart beat a little faster. I imagined all manner of stories and legends happening under the awning of the wild wood. All things that appear at the edges of dreams and nightmares. Illusory densities with eyes hiding in breaks of ferns, waiting for lost children to snap and lunge at. These were fantasies, though, closet-dwelling monsters that crept out in the creaky dark. Fantasies of horror, of which I soon would know the true depth of. The monsters of the mind could hold no lightless candle to the monster my family would encounter, or rather I would. The northern road meandered on, and I must have fallen into a restless half-sleep, because I remember the feeling of the car stopping. I could hear the sound of my father talking and the ticking of a tired engine in the background. I could see a blood-red dawn pierce the horizon from my place in the back seat. My mother turned again to see me rubbing my eyes. I felt her warm hand on my knee. "We're here, honey," she said. "Going to the campsite now." Where is it?" I said in a groggy voice. "Along the shoreline of the lake. It'll be beautiful." I sat upright as we went down the winding road. My father opened the windows and I could smell the spruce and dark hemlock that perfumed the air. The smell of the lake stole in as well, and I could detect the traces of something removed from mankind. A pungent but pleasant smell of water, and wet moss, of fish, and decaying oak and maple. Great lords of the forest, sinking their dead trunks into the crystal stillness of an untouched lake. We were close, and I was excited. Our family had gone camping a few times in northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. But this was the first time we had ventured to somewhere a little further from home. My sisters were awake now, too, and their faces brightened with equal optimism. They talked about the beavers and the deer and the big moose we would all see. A big, big moose, as little Amy called it. My father said it was possible. Maybe we would see their rubbings on trees. Great antlered sentinels of a secret nature. My mind, though, was on the teeth of bear and the talons of eagles. Being a young boy, I had no thoughts for quiet deer, or even stoic moose, for I longed to see carnivores, hunters racing past trees, barreling through the undergrowth. I got my wish when we reached the lake's edge, for on the reedy sand I saw a large bald eagle stripping a fish to the bone with its black claws. It looked up in annoyance as our car pulled up. I could see its golden eyes piercing through the windshield and into my mind. Its beak and feathered white head were covered in blood. Strings of gore hung from its yellow beak. In a sign of quick anger, it let out a terrifying series of cries that said, "You do not belong here. This is our home. Leave now." But it soon picked up the half-eaten fish and flew away. I helped my father with the tent until the canvas was taut and ready for decent habitation. My father smiled and put a hand on my shoulder. "Good job, son." The sense of accomplishment and the feel of his pride was like basking in a glorious sun. It made me feel like a man already. It made me feel strong. After the campsite was set up, we all decided to take the canoe out and paddle to one of the many islands that inhabited the lake, like little untouched drops of Eden. Drops from the paintbrush of God. It made me think as we slid along the cool breeze of the lake, along the headwind, and saw a scenic island appear before us for the very first time, that maybe this was all Eden itself, that the whole world was the garden, and us humans had never really left. Only we had tainted it, and twisted it, and manipulated it into something we couldn't recognize as beauty anymore, and that we told lies to ourselves that we were kicked out, because we knew deep down we had never left. But the knowledge of that hurt way more. I wondered at the time if that constituted as a white lie, or a lie a lighter shade of gray. When we reached the shoreline of the island, the wind picked up and flew through the trees. They all at once like a chorus whispered and flashed their silver-leaf undersides in welcoming of us. We decided to picnic here on the island till sunset, before heading back. My mom fussed over our life jackets, and as soon as the restraints were off, I, with my sisters in tow, went to explore the little island. "You're in charge of your sisters," my father called as we ran breathlessly away like children in a fairy tale. We soon circumnavigated the island and made ready to head into the interior. I took one last look at the wind-rippled water and led Amy and Hannah into the veil of thick trees that bordered the wet sands. As soon as we were under the canopy, the wind was gone. A hushed funeral silence lay about the wood. I could sense it even though I had no words at the time. Amy must have too, because she started to cry softly. I turned and bent down till I was at her eye level. "It's okay, Amy. We're just going to go explore." She began shaking her head back and forth in a childish way. Who knows? We might find a secret fort, I added. A secret fort? Her little voice pricked up almost immediately. Hannah went along. She was, of course, only a few years younger than I, and wanted to show how brave she was. Yeah, Amy, we might find a hidden land. Plus Mom and Dad are right on the beach. We'll yell to them if we need to, I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. Her bright blue eyes had dried up, even though I could see a few tears still glistening on her cheek. Not if we find a fort, though, she said. Not if we find a fort. With my little sisters behind me, we trekked farther into the island. A lot of the sun was blocked out, and the forest floor was filled with moss and stones and many brown pine needles. The silence seemed to deepen the deeper we got. Soon it was all around us, suffocating my bravery and my will to go on. My pulse quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Something was here. Something we couldn't see. The tension wound even tighter. It was like the heart-pounding moment before you go to check and see if there's a monster under your bed, where you bend down and hang your head over the mattress and see nothing, but when you raise your head up again, you see the monster was standing in the corner the whole time, watching you. A loud, bestial cry split the claustrophobic air, and Amy began to sob. I could hear my parents yelling from the beach, but my eyes were transfixed on something by a starved tamarack tree about 10 paces away. It stood unmoving on the forest floor. A grotesque stick figurine, mostly humanoid but with frightening disproportionate limbs. It seemed about 3 feet tall and had a face carved into the driftwood it was made from. The eyes, oh the eyes, burned out black and haunting. I stared at them, and they stared at me. My sisters had long run off to the sound of my parents' voices, but I could not move. I was transfixed and rooted to the spot. Did the cry come from the stick man, or did it come from somewhere else? I slowly crept over to the thing and saw to my horror that it was wrapped all around its gaunt body with hair. Human hair. Even the top of its driftwood skull had a layer of long, thin human hair hanging down from it. I screamed and ran back to the beach. I saw my mom hugging my frightened sisters, and I told my father what I had seen. I remember pawing and tugging at his shirt, begging him to not go in there, when he made a motion to leave us. He pulled me away and disappeared under the trees. My heart pounded like a drum the whole time until he came out again. My father knelt down like I had with my sister and told me not to be afraid, that it was most likely an old Native American guardian or something. He told me that a lot of the islands on the Lake of the Woods had never been explored. I felt better, but also felt like a coward, and I told him that I'd be braver in the future. I wanted him to be proud of me as a man. We decided to have our supper back at camp and loaded the canoe up at once. The twilight descended on us as we paddled back. I could see the reflection of pink clouds in the clear lake water. Tiny stars poked through the wisps of that beauty. They mirrored for moments, only to be rippled by the harmonious unity of my mother's and father's oars breaking the water. My mind could not fathom the natural beauty, for it was still in the dark enclosure of the island. Back there, next to the haunted totem of fear and anxiety. The image was burned into my mind, the starved skeleton figure who had 2 sunken eyes and 1 sunken soul. It had screamed at me and my sisters, and had looked at me, there was no doubt. It had watched me, seeing if I would run in fear, or wait till it moved on its own. I was sure if I had stayed only a few moments more, that it would have come alive and run at me on those horrible spindly legs. I was as sure as anything. The compulsion to look back at the island was so strong in that moment. I remember it pulling me back there with it. I needed to turn around and see if it watched me from the beach, standing near the water. I was just about to do it when I heard the long, haunting call of the loon. It rose somewhere over the placid surface of the dusk lake and ventured into my soul. The wild fluttering of its ancient call stirred up a primal feeling that broke my compulsion and replaced it with immeasurable fear. Soon the canoe beached on the opposite side, scraping against the bottom. We left it as we prepared for dinner. My dad had me help him get the fire started, likely as a distraction. Within 20 minutes, the flames were orange and the embers were glowing. Amy sat in my mother's lap while Hannah prepared s'mores. My father handed me the bag of marshmallows and smiled. I forgot my terror in that instant and felt safe in the comfort of my family. I took the soft white marshmallow and skewered it on the end of my steak. I thrust it in the fire for a few seconds and watched the outer covering go from yellow to brown to a patchy black. I had always liked my s'mores a little burnt. The crunch of the graham cracker and the taste of the melted chocolate warm in my mouth punctuated the fragrant burning of the pine wood. It made me happy and at peace. My thoughts strayed from my family to the girls at school. I thought about my half-remembered dream and the idea of kissing a girl, of being alone with one. All at once a new terror gripped me, a more pleasurable kind. But the thoughts soon died away, for all at once I perceived the end of the wind through the lakeward trees. Silence seemed to press in on all directions, coming from outside the ring of firelight to gnaw on my mind. Then my heart skipped a beat, and I almost cried out, for I could hear the thin hiss of another cry trailing across the moonlit lake. I could hear the cry from before, barely audible over the giggling of Amy and the voice of my father. At first it seemed to come from the island, but then I noticed it was coming from inside myself. Somehow, it had entered me. I could not explain it, but my face grew hot and my legs followed suit. I was again gripped with a compulsion to run away from the orange light and into the windless trees. "Are you okay?" my mother asked. "Yeah, Mom, I'm just a little hot," I said. "Well, sit back a little further from the fire." I couldn't, for I was already at the edge, and if I moved any further back, I would clip into the darkness. I wasn't even comfortable with my shifting shadow resting in the dark, lest it would be pulled into it by the claws of the woods. So I sat, while my dad told stories and sweated. A feverish fear fumed my body, and I couldn't sense anything but my own uncomfortable madness. Then I looked up at the night sky and saw the cold, distant stars, and my body cooled. All at once the silence left, and the wind struck up again. A large ember popped and frightened my sisters. But I was so thankful for the night breeze on my face. The wind whispered through the trees, and the woods creaked like the joints of some ancient nature god, aware of our presence. The fire crackled, and my father told my sisters and I not to worry about bears, that we had hoisted the food high enough, and that they shouldn't come nosing. But I wasn't worried about bears. I was worried about the presence that lingered in these woods, the one watching us, the one waiting for the perfect darkness. I was so thankful we'd all be sleeping in the same tent. Sleep didn't come, though. The night wore on, and I could hear the rustling of my family members as they turned over. I could hear the rustling of the trees, see their stick shadows play on the wall of the tent. My mind reeled as I saw them reaching closer and closer to the tent zipper. I almost yelled out to my dad in that moment, but fought the urge as hard as I could. I didn't want to be a scared boy anymore. But as soon as I found a shard of bravery, an awful smell wafted through the canvas. Awful, terrible, sickening. It reminded me of the one time my cousins and I ventured into an old abandoned barn on the edges of my aunt's and uncle's property. We walked in and were met with the smell of rot and the sight of thick black flies buzzing around the body of some dead animal. We ran out of there and back through the fields to the safety of our parents. The smell that entered the tent was worse than that, and now I was ready to cry out, but I couldn't. My voice didn't come. My scream didn't come. Just a panicking silence as I saw the shadow of some tall, gaunt stick figure move across the side of the tent. I couldn't yell or move except shiver uncontrollably as I saw it stop by the dead ashes of our late fire and turn its head our way. It seemed to freeze and stand unmoving. Tears of terror rolled down my cheeks, but yet I still could not move, only watch its hulking shadow against the moonlight. It stood there motionless for many minutes, before all at once rushing the tent. I almost blacked out, and my heart stopped as the shadow, probably 10 feet tall, charged at the opening. It was over. It was coming in. The monster that smelled like death. But just as the outline came within inches of the tent opening, it stopped. It stood there unmoving, staring at us. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. Panic awakened every fiber of my being as the creature stood there, waiting for me to acknowledge it in my mind before ripping the canvas open so I could look on its horrid face. Then a scream that was not my own reverberated from within my body. It sounded like the shriek of some elderly woman, only louder and more guttural. I must have bit my tongue or the inside of my cheek, for I tasted warm blood. Then the tent flap opened and my own scream finally released. It was gut-wrenching in its fear and sadness, and my parents woke up to the sound of their son ripping his vocal cords out with his terror. My father immediately bolted upright and crawled to the edge of the opening. The tattered tent flap swayed demonically in the breeze. I cried and cried, tears unloosed from their homes as my eyes registered the horror. My father must have glimpsed it, for he backed away inside like a frightened animal, trying to find a corner to hide in. Hannah and Amy cried as well. Even my mother was yelling, "What is it? What is it?" My father brought his finger to his lips, but it was no use. Us children were crying like hell had found us. The tall, gaunt creature, what I know now as the Wendigo, stood by the shore, its pale, visible ribcage illuminated in lake moonlight. There was a darkness swirling about its face, so all I could see was the torso and legs, the spindly legs like the hindquarters of some half-eaten deer. All thoughts of life and death left me in that moment as I perceived two glowing red eyes emerge from the black cloud that obscured its face. I was neither aware of thought nor emotion in that moment. Only I felt the realization that I had been offered up as sacrifice on the bloody altar of my own terror. It's hard for me to write this now. The vividness of the sight comes back to me. I should never have allowed my mind to open again. I should never have gone down this path. I want to scream now as I did as a child. But I will finish this if it's the last thing I do. The Wendigo stood not 10 feet back, and the sound of my sisters crying, the sound of my mother calling, it all stopped. They had entered the frozen fear I had awakened from. It was just me alone now, staring into the nightmare face of the beast. For the black smoke had cleared, and I could see the emaciated gray flesh pulled tight against rotting cheekbones. I could see lips that had been chewed off in an unbearable hunger. I could see long, stringy gray hair hanging lank around the face. I could see fangs dripping with blood. In fact, I could see trails of blood sliding down from its smiling mouth and into the open ribcage that housed its frozen heart. Then, all at once, a drumming began, and I could hear screams from the woods. Wild screams of hunger and despair. Ghosts, victims of the Wendigo. The drumming riled up as the creature again walked to our tent. I knew that I would be one of the ghosts in the woods when the creature was done eating me. I knew that there was no fighting it. But as the pale, starving creature with yellow fingernail claws walked toward us, it suddenly stopped and focused its eyes directly at me. For hours I seemed to stare at that horror. The red eyes merged into a swirling scene of madness, until I wasn't sure if I was already dead and in hell, or that a final death hallucination had taken over. All I know is the creature turned and stalked back into the woods. Our family left in the 3 a.m. darkness, our tires crunching on the gravel road as the sound of drumming and shrieking faded away. I thought this would all be over, opening this nightmare wound and letting the memory fill my head again, but it's not. It's not. The Wendigo spared me, and I need to know why. I am sorry, dear wife, but this is not at rest until I go back. It's calling for me to return. I can hear the sound of drumming from outside this very window. I can hear the ghostly wails here in the room with me now. I can't fight it. I can't fight it. My mind burns with fever. It is so hot. I must go back to those woods. I am leaving. I will see you when I return.